Commissioner Fielder, are you hearing us now? We've lost Commissioner Fielder off of the screen here. Okay. Commissioner Fielder, are you hearing us now? That sounded familiar. We've lost Commissioner Fielder off of the screen here. Okay. Ain't electronics great? Wow. She should be on momentarily. Well, we have the written record for Commissioner Fielder to appeal to. So let's resume. Are we okay, Mr. Wizard? Yep, we're fine. Thank you. Go ahead.
I believe I just asked you whether that provision would hurt Kelp, since all it does is clarify that Kelp would receive any tax credits associated with its facility.
Let me interrupt for a moment. Remind us again, what document are you looking at right now?
SIS 1.
Okay, is this still the 8.5 that you talked about before?
No, we are on section 13.2.
Thank you.
I can't think of any negative impact on Kelp other than there's no anticipated tax benefits of operation of this facility. Seems to be a provision that is designed for renewables, which the economics are largely based on tax credits.
You can test the warranty provision if you want to refer to section 3.1 of SIS 1.
Sorry, what 3.1? What was your question?
It's on 3.1. I'll wait till you get there. And that's a warranty provision where Kelp would represent that it investigated and determined that it's capable of performing throughout the contract. Is that right?
Yes.
You don't think Kelp should have to make that representation simply because it's been operating for decades? Is that right?
Yeah. So the avoided cost capacity pricing was not based on a guaranteed capacity. Yes, it was. It was based on a commitment for average capacity during peak periods.
I'm sorry. You contested this warranty provision in your testimony. And this warranty provision says that Kelp would represent that it investigated and determined that it's capable of performing throughout the contract. Isn't that right?
Again, that is right, but the reason for the objection is it appears to relate to the design of a new facility as opposed to a facility that has a long operating history.
If facilities deteriorate over time, right?
Not if they're well maintained, but they will deteriorate over time based on normal expected life operating characteristics of facilities.
Right. So just because something has historically operated doesn't mean it's guaranteed to operate forever, right?
It can require certain capital retrofits in order to maintain operations. That's true.
So Kelp's not willing to warrant that it's investigated and determined that it's capable of performing under the contract?
Well, the logic of this is concern about distinguishing Kelp as being a facility that has been in service for a long period of time and is not a new build with unproven technology.
Well, wouldn't this warranty provision also be applicable to so that Kelp can represent that it's kept its facilities updated over time and it's capable of performing throughout the contract?
To the extent that Kelp does not perform under the contract, then no payments will be made to Kelp. So there's a performance-based element of actual operations that is included in the contract.
But if Kelp's opposed to warranting that it's investigated and determined that it could actually perform under this contract.
I think that this is where we're getting into a little gray area for legal restrictions versus economic and engineering considerations.
This is your
From an-
testimony, right?
It is from an economic and engineering standpoint. The paragraph reads as a warranty concerning a new build, which Kelp is not.
But that's the point. If Kelp has historically operated and is confident that it will perform throughout this contract, why is Kelp afraid to warrant that it's made that investigation and determined that it could perform under the contract?
I'll repeat the same thing. The contract only pays Kelp to the extent it actually delivers capacity and energy to Northwestern. That there's an implicit warranty in that pricing structure, implicit representation that it plans to deliver power, and if it doesn't, it won't be paid.
You also contest the maximum output provision that simply limits Kelp to its contracted capacity, and that's section 3.8 of SIS 1, right?
Well, this paragraph kind of lies in face of how Kelp has actually been operated over the last 30 years and now proposes to operate in the same manner going forward. Is the contract is based on, capacity commitments during on-peak hours in the summer and non-summer period, but is free to provide capacity in excess of, in some cases below, that average commitment. So there's no obligation for Kelp to meet a nameplate capacity rating under the agreement, but rather it's a commitment to supply the billable capacity and energy under the terms of the PPA.
That just limits Kelp's output to 42 megawatts, right?
Doesn't specify that, but it would be the nameplate capacity would actually be the net nameplate capacity of 42 megawatts.
Do you believe Kelp should be entitled to transmit more than 42 megawatts onto Northwestern system?
I don't know if they're capable of generating more than net 42 megawatts and delivering to Northwest system.
So if it's not capable, why can't Kelp represent that it won't expand its facility to produce more than 42 megawatts?
In terms of the contract should reasonably align with the pricing structure of the contract and the product being sold to Northwestern. And we think this paragraph doesn't align with the pricing structure in the proposed PPA.
Don't you think Northwestern needs some assurances that Kelp won't build more onto its facility and produce more than 42 megawatts?
That's a concern Northwestern hasn't expressed to date, and I would think that would have implications in terms of the generation interconnection agreement if they change the facility,
Absolutely.
which they haven't done.
You contest Northwestern's insurance requirements too, right?
Which paragraph?
That's section 10 of SIS 1.
Well, KELP doesn't have direct employees, so it objected to having insurance related to those employees. They're outsourced.
Okay, can you read that 10.1.1 again? All that says is if KELP has one or more employees, it needs employer's liability insurance, right?
As
So if KELP doesn't have any of those employees, that provision wouldn't require them to do anything, right?
as a non-lawyer, I would think that makes sense.
Okay. And KELP could retain employees theoretically in the future too, right?
I don't know what the limitations would be on that with KELP.
But they could employ somebody.
Different method of operating the facility. It's possible.
Okay, and if they did, then that's when this provision would be triggered, right?
Potentially.
And you claim the general liability insurance and excess insurance in 10.1.3, I believe, are inappropriate because they're more appropriate for a new build, right?
It's generally not consistent with the operation of the facility today.
Those insurance levels aren't consistent with KELP's operations today. Did I get that right?
Well, their general and liability insurance that was inconsistent with terms of the contract.
Okay, you got your exhibits in front of you?
Yes.
Can you please go to exhibit MPG 7 and go to page 60 for me, please?
And there
That's a certificate of insurance for KELP, right?
it is.
That's the same levels of insurance that Northwestern is requiring in its contract, right?
Appears to be.
Okay. So is it really unreasonable for Northwestern to require KELP to provide those same levels of insurance in the certificate that you're looking at?
Maybe an issue we need to explore with KELP.
I agree. You also contest the cross default provisions with the LGIA, is that right?
Default provisions. I'm sorry. Could you give me a section, please?
Yeah, I believe it's I don't have that section reference right in front of me, but it's in your testimony, in your rebuttal testimony. You think it's going to create too much risk if there's a default provision in Northwestern's PPA if it defaults under an LGIA. Is that right?
I apologize for moving through these terms a little slowly. Can you tell me where my testimony is?
It's okay. Yeah, it's on page 60 of your testimony. Oh, sorry. It's on page 58 of your testimony. It's under like number paragraph 3. Middle of the page.
Can you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, you can test the cross default provision, right?
If I could help, I think it's page 57, not page 58.
No, I apologize. I'm looking at a red line version.
Yeah. Maybe call the witness attention to lines 8 through 10, I think is.
Okay. I found the, I'm sorry, can I ask you to repeat the question?
Yeah, are you contesting that cross default provision?
Yes.
And can Kelp transmit energy onto Northwestern system without an agreement with Northwestern Transmission?
I wouldn't think so.
Okay, so if it's agreement with Northwestern Transmission or defaulted and it couldn't produce anything on Northwestern system, don't you think the PPA should be defaulted too?
Essentially, the economic transactions between Kelp and Northwestern would be terminated to the extent Kelp could meet its delivery obligations of capacity and energy.
Right. So isn't it important to keep that provision in there so that Kelp doesn't default under its interconnection agreement?
I think under the old PPA, the interconnection agreement was simply part of the PPA. We're proposing that to be similar here.
Right. We're talking about Northwestern's provisions right now, right? So you're contesting this provision. And I'm asking you, if we use Northwestern's contract, wouldn't it be important to keep this provision in to incentivize Kelp not to default under the interconnection agreement?
I think in this area, there's some disagreement on an interconnection agreement, whether or not, the current arrangement needs to be modified. So I guess that creates some uncertainty about whether or not their PPA language aligns with that disagreement between the parties on the structure of an interconnection agreement and the appropriateness of separately stating or just continuing to include that interconnection agreement based on the terms it has previously been
Okay.
engaged in the PPA arrangements between the parties.
Okay. So let's forget about all the disagreements between the parties on these. If we took Northwestern's proposed PPA that you're looking at right there and Kelp executed an LGIA, which is what this provision contemplates, wouldn't it be important to have this cross default provision in the PPA to incentivize Kelp not to default under the LGIA?
Well, again, we'd have to confirm with Kelp, but if the commission approves such an agreement, it'd be important for Kelp to comply with the agreement and meet the terms.
Thanks. Now let's go to section 2 of your PPA. I believe it's MPG 5.
Okay. Specific page.
Section 2.
And there.
That section says that the PPA will run until the expiration of the operating life of the facility. Is that right?
Yes.
So is Kelp not expecting to perform under the contract for the entire 18.5-year term?
I think Kelp has made it pretty clear it's only able to operate as long as the Rosebud mine is supplying coal to Colstrip Unit 4, which is currently expected to be around 2042. To the extent Colstrip Unit 4 retires early, then Kelp will no longer be obligated under the terms of this agreement.
Okay, so if Kelp doesn't have a fuel supply, he wants the contract to terminate, right?
Basically, would not be able to supply capacity and energy to Northwest Energy.
On that same logic, would it be appropriate for the PPA to terminate if Kelp itself was dissolved?
I would have to confer with Kelp and their attorneys on that issue.
Well, if Kelp didn't exist anymore, I imagine the PPA should terminate, right?
I'm going to object to the extent that calls for a legal conclusion. Let me explain that the actual corporate organization is nuanced and complicated, and identifying one element of a corporate structure and talking about its dissolution, I think is beyond the scope of this witness's expertise as a non-attorney.
And I would say, all I'm saying is if an entity doesn't exist, it shouldn't be entitled to receive the benefits of a contract. That's not, I don't believe that raises the legal conclusion at all.
I wish I could comment on this and ask you what you meant by that, but I'll just sustain the objection.
Chairman O'Donnell, I'm going to present some confidential information. I'll confirm with Kelp's counsel to make sure that that's they want to pull everyone out of here.
When you reach that agreement, then we'll go off the record at that point. If that comes about.
If there's a specific section. As the general principle, this is.